For 18 months, Mitchell Quay was the man on television asking for his wife back. He invited reporters into his home. He rang radio phone-ins. He sat on the sofa of This Morning, opposite Richard and Judy, and talked about Lindsay, the wife who, he said, had walked out, run off with another man, and left her children behind. A documentary crew asked him directly, "Did you kill Lindsay?" He said, "I'm not going to answer that question because I don't need to." Then he smiled and said, "Wait and find out." Lindsay Quay was 21. She had been strangled in her own home in December of 1998, while her children slept in another room. By the time he was on national television, she had been dismembered and buried in pieces, part of her in a shallow grave at Southport Pleasureland near a roller coaster. He knew where she was the entire time. Every appeal, every interview, every camera pointed at his face. There is a line you have probably heard before, that the person who reports her missing is usually the one who did it. That is not a statistic. No peer-reviewed study supports it. No police force publishes it. It's folklore, a thing true crime says to itself. And for years, investigators believed something just as comforting, that you could hear guilt. A 2009 study claimed innocent callers ask for help for the victim twice as often as guilty ones. American police were taught it through an FBI bulletin before it had ever been peer-reviewed. Then it came apart. 5 later studies found no relationship between those so-called guilty indicators and actual guilt, and the FBI's own researchers warned it should never be used to build a real case. You cannot hear it. That is the point. The voice cracks in the right places. The appeal hits every beat. He stands at the edge of the search with his arms folded, and he looks exactly like a man whose wife is missing, because there is no reliable way for a face to look guilty. What holds up is duller and harder to beat. The researchers Ferguson and Petherick examined more than 100 staged crime scenes and found a pattern. The victim is typically found in her own home, and frequently she is found by the person who staged it. The story only has to survive a first impression. The evidence has to survive for years. 5 real cases, 5 men who told one story out loud, and a different one with a router, a fuel gauge, a search bar, and the tide. Case 1. Helen Bailey. Helen Bailey was 51, and she wrote the Electra Brown books for teenagers. Her first husband had drowned on holiday in 2011, and she had written about that grief in public, honestly at length. That is how Ian Stewart found her, in an online group for the bereaved. For months before she died, Stewart had been feeding Helen Zopiclone, a sleeping drug prescribed to him and administered to her. Hair analysis proved it went back to at least February. And on her own computer, Helen had been searching the internet, trying to work out why she kept falling asleep in the afternoons. She was Googling her own poisoning. On the 11th of April, 2016, Helen was last seen walking her miniature dachshund, Boris. That same afternoon, Stewart substantially increased a standing order out of her bank account and tried to use her power of attorney to sell a flat she owned, telling the solicitor she was too unwell to attend. He waited 4 days, then he reported her missing and told police she had left him a note. She needed space. She had gone to their holiday cottage in Broadstairs in Kent. No note was ever produced. It did not exist. Which is how a router caught him. He drove down to that Broadstairs cottage, the place he had sworn Helen had gone, still carrying her iPhone. The cottage had a live wireless network. Her phone came into range and quietly connected to it, the day after he reported her missing. Not Helen. Him, with her phone, in the house he had sent police to imagine her sitting in, alone. The prosecutor told the jury he might have got away with it. On the 15th of July, police opened a concealed cesspit beneath the garage. Helen was inside it, and Boris was in there with her, because a woman who runs away takes her dog with her. He had been living in the house above her for 3 months. No cause of death could ever be established. The judge found he had smothered her while she was sedated for a life insurance policy worth £1.28 million. St. Albans Crown Court convicted him of murder. Life, minimum 34 years. 5 years later, a second court convicted him of murdering his first wife Diane, a death everyone had written down as epilepsy. Case 2. Karen Ristevsky. Karen Ristevsky was 47. She and her husband Boss ran a boutique in Melbourne, and it was losing money. On the morning of the 29th of June 2016, they argued about it. Somewhere between about 9 and 11, Karen died in her own home. Nobody can tell you how. Her body wasn't found for 8 months, and by then no pathologist could determine a cause of death. Boss reported her missing. He said she had gone out to clear her head. He joined the appeals. He sat beside their daughter while the country looked for her. And when Karen was finally found, he helped carry her coffin. Then the phones talked. His mobile switched off at 11:19 in the morning, on the freeway, heading out of the city. Hers pinged a tower near Gisborne at 11:40, about 50 kilometers from home, and went dark. 2 phones, 21 minutes apart, in the same corridor, going quiet together. And then there was the fuel gauge. He hadn't told police he drove Karen's Mercedes at all that day. When that became impossible to maintain, he said he'd taken it out to test a faulty fuel gauge and that the fault corrected itself when he drove over a bump. The mechanics who serviced that car had never recorded any fault with the gauge. A jolt does not repair an instrument cluster. In February of 2017, a bushwalker found Karen in Macedon Regional Park, wedged between 2 fallen logs. Here's the part that gets told wrong constantly. Boss Ristevsky was never convicted of murder. On the eve of trial, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, because without a cause of death, intent could not be proved. He got 9 years. The Court of Appeal called that manifestly inadequate and raised it to 13, and the Chief Justice said he had shown not one scintilla of remorse. He has still never said what happened in that house. Case 3. Anna Walshy. Anna Walshy was 39, a real estate executive, a mother of 3 small boys. She was last seen in the early hours of New Year's Day, 2023, at home in Cohasset, Massachusetts. Her husband Brian did not report her missing. Her employer did on the 4th of January, when she didn't come to work. Brian gave police his account that day. Anna had left early on New Year's morning for an emergency work trip, flying out of Logan to Washington. No airline record ever showed that she did. He was, at that moment, on home confinement, awaiting sentencing for selling counterfeit Andy Warhols. What sank him was a search history, some of it on a family iPad, including his son's. On the 27th of December, before anything had happened at all, what's the best state to divorce for a man? Then, in the hour before he said Anna left for the airport, how long before a body starts to smell? How to stop a body from decomposing? 10 ways to dispose of a dead body if you really need to. How long for someone to be missing to inherit? Later that day, how long does DNA last? How to clean blood from a wooden floor? And then the question that tells you he already knew the answer to all the others. Can you be charged with murder without a body? On the 2nd of January, a Home Depot camera recorded him in a black surgical mask and blue gloves, paying cash, around $450 of mops, buckets, tarps, a Tyvek suit, goggles, baking soda, and a hatchet. At a transfer station in Peabody, investigators pulled 10 rubbish bags, a hacksaw, a hatchet, towels, rugs, that protective suit. DNA matching Anna's was on the blade and on the handle. Anna Walshy has never been found, not in the transfer station, not in the incinerator, not anywhere. But he'd answered his own question. You can be charged with murder without a body, and convicted of it. In November of 2025, he pleaded guilty to misleading investigators and to improper conveyance of a body. He did not plead guilty to murder. He fought that one to a verdict, and a jury convicted him of murder in the 1st degree. Life without parole. The judge called it barbaric and incomprehensible. Case 4. Lacey Peterson. Christmas Eve 2002. Lacey Peterson was 27 and heavily pregnant with a son they had already named Connor. Her husband Scott said he'd left that morning to fish for sturgeon at the Berkeley Marina, 90 miles away. That evening he rang Lacey's mother to say Lacey was missing, and her family called the police. Other people remembered Scott telling them, that same day, that he'd been golfing. He searched. He stood at the vigils. He went on national television and told Diane Sawyer he'd had absolutely nothing to do with her disappearance, while a police tracker was already recording every trip that truck made. Now go back to the 6th of December. That is the day Scott Peterson learned he could no longer keep his marriage hidden from a woman named Amber Frey. The next day, the 7th, the computer in his house was used to search for boats for sale. On the 8th, to look up nautical charts and the currents and maps of the water around a place called Brooks Island. On the 9th, he bought a boat with cash, turning down the anchors that came with it, and told almost nobody he owned it. Not his father, not his father-in-law, a keen fisherman who kept inviting him out. And that same day, the 9th of December, he told Amber Frey that he had lost his wife, that this would be his first holiday season without her. Lacey was alive. She was at home, pregnant, planning Christmas. 4 months later, in April of 2003, a couple walking their dog found the body of a baby boy on the shoreline, just over a mile from Brooks Island. The next morning, about a mile from where Connor was found, Lacey washed ashore at Point Isabel. No cause of death could ever be determined for either of them. He was convicted in November of 2004, and you should know exactly where that stands, because this case attracts myths. In 2020, the California Supreme Court threw out his death sentence over the way the jury had been selected and affirmed his conviction. He was resentenced to life without parole. He is not on death row. Every claim since has failed. He has never confessed. There is no confession on the Amber Frey tapes. There never was. Case 5. Lindsay Quay. On the 16th of December, 1998, Lindsay told her husband she was going ahead with the divorce. He held her by the neck on the floor for 20 minutes. Then he put her body in a bedroom and sealed the door with towels so his children would not smell their mother. He cut her up in the bath he bathed those children in, and his brother Elliot held the bin bags open. Then he told a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old that Mummy had run away, but she would be back soon. And here is the detail that reframes all of it. Mitchell Quay never reported his wife missing. He said nothing at all for 7 weeks. Police only came to the house because a social worker got worried. There was no body, so they built the case out of paper instead. He had been stealing Lindsay's benefit checks and cashing them after her death, a dead woman's money, moving through a living man's hands. And they established that Lindsay herself had phoned the benefits agency from a phone box to ask where her money had gone. That call fixed the last moment anyone could prove she was alive. It was almost certainly the last conversation of her life. Quay was arrested in June of 2000. Within hours of being charged, he told them what he had done with her. The next day they found her torso at Southport Pleasureland. The day after that, her arms and legs beside a railway line. Her head and hands have never been recovered. After 18 months of performance, he never let it reach a jury. He had denied murder and admitted manslaughter. Then, as his trial opened, he changed his plea to guilty. Life minimum. 17 years, he has been refused parole again and again. Look at what actually broke these 5 men. A router log, a fuel gauge that could not have fixed itself, a search bar, a tide chart, a cashed benefit check. Not one of them was caught because somebody watched him cry and decided it looked wrong. The demeanor was fine. Every one of them passed as a grieving husband in front of trained officers, in front of the woman's own family, some of them on television, for days, or months, or a year and a half. What none of them could pass was the paperwork of an ordinary life, the tower your phone reaches for, the network your handset joins, the account you quietly emptied, the question you typed at 2 a.m. when you believed the room was empty. None of it performs. None of it gets nervous. None of it is trying to be believed. And it's worth saying plainly what these cases have in common. In a CDC analysis across 18 states, more than half of the women whose circumstances were known were killed in connection with intimate partner violence. In England and Wales, 42% of adult women killed were killed by a partner or an ex. The United Nations counted around 85,000 women and girls killed worldwide. In 2023, roughly 60% of them by a partner or a family member. One woman every 10 minutes. The stranger was never the danger. If any of this sounds like a house you know, the phone that gets checked, the friend who quietly disappeared, the money that moved without a conversation, the National Domestic Violence Hotline in the United States is 800-799-7233. You can also text the word START to 887-888. If this one stayed with you, like it and subscribe.